Good afternoon, and welcome to the last episode in the series, Hindsight, the Iraq War. Today, we will be focusing on how two members of Parliament justified what they believed to be the most difficult decision of their political careers, the vote over the invasion of Iraq. Sir John Chilcot's report, which is an inquiry that embraces the run-up to the conflict in Iraq, the military action and its aftermath, is verging on nearly 6 years short of its due date. It is set to be published in June or July of this year and will no doubt be an interesting piece for war truce that this country has been waiting for. How much responsibility for the invasion can we place on Britain and former Prime Minister Tony Blair? Or does the responsibility rest with former President George Bush and our American allies? 70 years on from the Sinews of Peace speech by Winston Churchill, where the term special relationship was coined, is it possible to challenge the relationship between Bush and Blair in their coalition for war? To answer these questions, we have on the show Anne Campbell, former Labour MP for Cambridge, and Jack Straw, former Foreign Secretary, who both voted on the 18th of March 2003, but with opposing views, with Miss Campbell voting against invading and Mr. Straw voting for. The format of the show will be the same as previous episodes. Firstly, an interview with Anne Campbell, followed by Jack Straw, before we reach a question and answer session with the audience. If you would like to have your questions answered, please call us on 0800 344 593. Text us at 0892 458 002, or tweet us at Hindsight Series. We are also conducting a poll of your opinions over the course of the show. We want to know whether, in hindsight, do you believe that the invasion of Iraq was the correct choice at the time? Forgetting the benefit of hindsight, whose argument was the most convincing of the time? Depending on which MP you agree with, tweet us with the hashtag #IHateJack or #IHAteAnne, and any views you wish to share. Welcome, Anne. Thank you very much for coming on the show today to share your views with us. Anne Campbell undertook her degree at Cambridge University, sat on the Cambridge County Council between 1985 and 1989 before she was elected Labour MP for Cambridge in 1992, until she lost her seat in 2005 to David Howarth of the Liberal Democrats. When it came to the 18th of March 2003, Anne voted against the invasion of Iraq. Would you care to elaborate why?
Well, it didn't seem to me that there was any good justification for it. What I was worried about, I think, was the Americans and the British seeing themselves as the sort of world's policemen when there clearly wasn't, a consensus of opinion that we should go into Iraq. I think I was also quite influenced by Robin Cook, if you remember Robin Cook, who died shortly after I left Parliament in 2005. He resigned over the Iraq War. He resigned from government. And he was quite convinced that there were no weapons of mass destruction when everybody else believed that there were. So I think I was quite influenced by that.
The issue surrounding whether or not weapons of mass destruction did exist is a contentious issue. Both governments were insistent and convinced that there was evidence of weapons of mass destruction existing.
It was a great failure of intelligence, actually, and I think it's very difficult to know what happened. But I think what happened was that Tony Blair was a barrister by training, so he had been used to taking a brief and persuading people. So that was the thing to do. You know, my view is that he totally believed that there were weapons of mass destruction. He had been told by the security services, and so he wasn't as critical as he should be at the intelligence provided. But I think he felt that he was right. He knew it was a difficult decision, but you know, sometimes there's almost a kick out of taking what you believe to be the right decision, even though everybody else is opposing it. If you look at pictures of the time, you can see the kind of stress and strain that he was undergoing. He looked terrible. You know, he was drawn and looked much older, great bags under his eyes, clearly wasn't sleeping, so he didn't do it easily. I think it really was quite a difficult thing for him to do.
Looking back with hindsight to the Iraq War, do you think that Blair wishes he had never gone now, or that he still stands by his weapon of mass destruction theory?
Well, he could not stand by the weapons of mass destruction argument, as clearly there weren't any. Or I mean, there may have been some, but they've all disintegrated or whatever. So I think he probably wishes he had questioned the security services a bit more closely and tried to get more evidence for that. I mean, it's quite an important lesson. One of the things that governance is about is asking questions and making sure that people can justify them, and being an MP is quite good practice ground for that. And so that would be my criticism. that the intelligence that Tony was given was incorrect, and I don't think that he was deliberately lying. I think it would be inconceivable if he was lying, but he did believe the evidence, but he believed what he was told on too little evidence, and he should have questioned that much more closely, but he didn't. I mean, it's possible that, having struck up this relationship with George Bush, he felt more compelled to believe what he was being told, but I don't think that's an excuse, really.
Talking about George Bush, do you believe that the former president of the United States played an important role in influencing Blair's decision over invading Iraq?
I don't know. It will be very interesting to see what Chilcot says, and whether there was any evidence that there was a prior agreement between Bush and Blair that they would attack Iraq after the 9/11 bombings. But 9/11 was in 2001, and we went into war in 2003. So, it is not inconceivable that in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks on the States, they came to some sort of tacit agreement. I mean, the Americans were definitely going to attack whether we did or not. I mean, their troops were in Iraq before we made the decision to join them. It would have been impossible to do what Harold Wilson did and say, no, we're not doing it, as he did with Vietnam. But I just don't think there's any question of him being driven by Bush. I think it was more that there was an agreement between them. It wasn't a master-puppet relationship. It was a friend relationship.
But this friend relationship, often labelled as a special relationship, was seen as very unusual due to the polar political views of the two leaders.
Yes, actually. In the Parliamentary Labour Party meetings on a Monday night, Tony used to get completely slated over his friendship with George Bush. People were fairly outspoken. There'd be MPs saying, "Why on earth, Tony, are you friends with a right-wing American president?" But I think they did form quite a close friendship, and they had their religion in common, and I suppose most Labour MPs are not particularly religious, so did not understand that at all.
I see, but when it came to the vote and the government trying to justify it, what was the mood like within the party?
Well, it was very interesting, actually, because MPs can get quite vicious with each other when they disagree. But during the Iraq War, I think everybody realised how difficult the people had found it, the decision. So most people wanted to support the party. I mean, I think the other thing that we forget is that popular opinion in the country was that we should go to war. So anybody who opposed that was actually probably going against their own voters as well as the government. Conservatives were in support, the Liberal Democrats were not. But actually, at the end of the day, there are more Labour MPs who voted against the Iraq War than there were Liberal Democrats that voted against it. Another thing people forget. So, I mean, there wasn't the sort of backbiting and nastiness that can sometimes be if people oppose you. There was just quite a lot of sympathy and understanding.
Although, due to your role as Parliamentary Private Secretary, it meant that in public you had to campaign and argue alongside party lines. What were you saying behind closed doors?
I mean, you realise that something really big and momentous was happening, and it felt quite strange to be there and be in the middle of it and know that you were a small part of that decision. There were quite a lot of occasions when there seemed to be a possibility of trying to persuade people it was the wrong thing to do. So I went to see Tony on about 5 or 6 different occasions, usually with a group of other people, to say, look, don't do it. And clearly we weren't getting anywhere. I mean, as you said, because I was Parliamentary Private Secretary at the time, I could not speak out against the government without resigning, but of course I could argue privately. So it wasn't until the vote, where we had to vote whether to go to war or not, that I could not support the government at that point, and then I had to resign in order to vote against.
Thank you, Anne. Anne will stay with us in the studio to take questions after we hear from Jack Straw on his views surrounding the invasion of Iraq. Mr. Straw received a degree in law from the University of Leeds. He held the post of president of the NUS from 1969 to 71, despite losing out on the office on 2 previous occasions. In 1971, he was elected as Labour Councillor of Islington until 1978. He was elected as MP for Blackburn 1979, a seat he held until he stepped down from Parliament in 2015. During his time as MP, he was a member of the Cabinet and during the Iraq War held the position of Foreign Secretary. Thank you for joining us on the show today, Jack.
Thank you for having me.
Why do you believe that the invasion of Iraq was necessary?
Iraq had a long history of pushing the boundaries when it came to how it went about dealing with its foreign policy objectives. The regime in Iraq had invaded Iran and Kuwait within a decade of one another. The subsequent sanctions that the United Nations had placed on the country had been an ineffective deterrent when it came to attempting to force Saddam to comply with the UN weapons inspectors. Conditions in the country were so awful that the inspectors had no choice to withdraw. Containment had been attempted, and UN Resolution 1409 marked the failure of the containment of Iraq. The global community was in agreement that Iraq had to be dealt with, and that the weapons of mass destruction were present in the country. Even though China, Russia, and France were against an invasion and strengthening sanctions placed in Iraq, it is clear that they too knew something had to be done about the country. The regime had to be controlled one way or another.
Did you truly believe that there were weapons of mass destruction present in Iraq before the invasion?
The view that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction was a view that was held across the world. When we got into Iraq, he had got rid of his weapons of mass destruction and had managed to trick the world. He appeared stronger than he actually was. All of the intelligence pointed towards weapons of mass destruction being present in the country, and this threat had to be dealt with. In the end, there were no weapons of mass destruction ever found in the country, and it was a major mistake. But it was a mistake made by the whole of the international community.
And what was the mood like within the party before the vote?
The mood was sombre. Robin Cook, leader of the House, resigned and received an unprecedented standing ovation within the House after his speech. The speech I gave to the House presented the huge decision the MPs had to make. My family were present, and everyone was aware of the magnitude of the situation. It was the biggest decision I have ever had to make, and the biggest decision I will ever have to make.
Would you say then that, on the whole, you agreed with Tony Blair's policies?
I always supported Tony. I think people have to understand that the decision to go to war in Iraq was one of the most difficult decisions I have ever had to make. No one took the decision to take an entire country to war lightly. To know that there would be civilian as well as military casualties as a result is not an easy decision to make. People have to understand that when it came to Iraq, no matter the outcome of the vote in the House of Commons on March 18, 2003, the USA were always going to invade the country. Their troops were already mobilised and ready to attack. Tony was an excellent Prime Minister, and the difficult decisions he had to make as Prime Minister should be admired.
Earlier, we were talking about the special relationship with Anne, and in particular, how this presented itself between Bush and Blair. Do you believe that Bush had an influence on Blair's decision to go to war?
Of course Bush influenced Blair, as Blair influenced Bush. Tony managed to get Bush to agree on a week's delay on the invasion until the House of Commons had voted. Considering the dysfunctional conditions of the Bush administration, this feat should be seen as a great achievement. The international community were all in agreement that there was weapons of mass destruction present in Iraq and that these weapons posed a risk. Although France and Germany did not agree to war, even though they were convinced that weapons of mass destruction had to be dealt with, when it comes to the meeting at Crawford when Blair supposedly pledged Britain's support for any military action the USA were to undertake in Iraq, Christopher Meyer, the man who claimed Britain's support would be given in blood, was not present. I think the influence that George Bush held over Tony Blair has been greatly exaggerated by the media, and it was more of a partnership in the face of a great uncertainty.
And finally, Jack, do you stand by your decision to vote in favour of the invasion of Iraq, based on the evidence you knew then? And as former Foreign Secretary, do you have any feelings towards the state of the country now?
I still stand by taking the country to war. As I stated earlier, it was the hardest decision I have ever had to make, and will ever make. But the international community believed weapons of mass destruction were present in the country. I hold a burden of responsibility, and I have a deep frustration and regret at the unnecessary loss of life. Though hindsight is a wonderful thing, no one could have predicted that Iraq would be in the position it is now. I do feel some responsibility for that. But I also feel that blame has to be placed on the Iraqi Prime Minister, Maliki, who refused to allow the Sunnis to become fully involved in government.
Thank you very much, Jack. Thank you for all of the questions that have been tweeted in throughout the show. Unfortunately, we do not have time to ask Anne and Jack everything, but here is a select few. We have a tweet from We Want Answers, who asked Anne, do you believe that the Iraq War cost you your seat in 2005, despite that you voted against it? And do you still stick by your decision?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have to vote in the end in the way you believe in, and it was quite hard to get that message over to some of my constituents. I mean, Before I said I was opposed to it, and I was trying to defend the government's position, I had people come to me and say, but we've got a petition with 10, 15,000 signatures on it. And so, that meant I had to do what they thought, rather than what I thought. I made the point that, look, I am here as your MP. You can try and influence me, and I'm here to listen to what you have to say. I can test out my arguments on you, but at the end of the day, I have to make my own decision about it. That's what you elected me for. This idea of representative democracy is quite an interesting one, and how it plays out in practice.
We have another tweet asking about your opinion of citizens' arrest towards Blair.
Oh, it's stupid. I mean, there is a lot of venom directed at Tony. But what they have to understand is that the situation at the time, and even now, is not so clear-cut. I mean, the regime in Iraq was horrible, and the ghastly things that were going on, unthinkable, really. A lot of people, whether they agreed with the war or not, believed we had to do something. So I think a lot of people thought that if we could just take out Saddam, then that would have solved the problem. But anyway, how ethical is that? I think the big strategic mistake after we went in was that we didn't have any kind of plan for what happened afterwards. So it's assumed that the Iraqis would fall into our arms and say, oh, aren't you wonderful, delivering us from all of this? But of course, there's also a lot of atrocities from both the British and American troops, which did not endear the local population towards us. I have a constituent who helped me actually during the election campaign, who was Iraqi and said that who had a lot of relatives in Baghdad, and he said to me very soon after the war that the Americans and British soldiers are behaving really badly, and that they are antagonising the local population. That didn't really come out until afterwards.
We have just enough time for one more question. We have on the line Emma from London. Hello, please ask your question.
I have a question for both Anne and Jack. You've both talked about the special relationship between Blair and Bush, but would you say that it was in fact the work of Colin Powell that had a lasting impact on the decision to invade and the public opinion surrounding the invasion?
Anne, would you like to take that one first?
Yes. Yes. The masterstroke really was putting up Colin Powell, who people did trust, and he was pointing out and showing photographs on TV saying, this is where we think there are weapons of mass destruction, and this is where the missiles are based, and so on. And he was a very credible source, and he clearly believed it.
And Jack, your thoughts?
I personally had a great relationship with Colin Powell. As the Iraq drama intensified, the calls between myself and Colin increased. On the face of it, we may be seen as unlikely friends, but I would safely say that he is one of the sanest men I've ever met. In July 2002, I took a trip to the Hamptons to meet Colin Powell, and I left the meeting hopeful that although it would take a great amount of effort, the Bush administration would go through the UN.
Thank you very much, Jack. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. As mentioned at the beginning of the show, we asked our listeners to tweet us who they thought at the time of the Iraq invasion made the informed decision in the vote to invade in 2003. We appreciate everyone's comments and answers, but the poll is in, and the decision on whether Anne or Jack made the right choice in your eyes has been determined. Referring just to the results received on tonight's show, it was almost a tie, but by 2 votes, the audience agree that without the benefit of hindsight, Jack Straw did make the correct decision at the time by voting in favour of the invasion of Iraq. Although hindsight does arguably show Anne's viewpoint to have been the right choice, as a result of what has happened post-invasion, the viewers saw Jack's argument to be the logical decision of the time. We also continue to forget, as pointed out by both Anne and Jack, that it was indeed an accepted decision amongst the British and American public during the time. Therefore, forgetting the benefit of hindsight, his interview highlights why so many decided to vote in favour of the invasion. And we have now come to the end of the show, and to the end of the series. Thank you to everyone who has participated in our ongoing historical series for the past few weeks, and a special thank you to Anne Campbell and Jack Straw, who were kind enough to join us in the studio today for our final episode, Hindsight, the Iraq War. We would also like to say a big thank you to those who have been tuning in to listen to each episode, as well as those who have called in or tweeted us some great questions. Have a good evening, and remember to listen out for our next series coming soon.